Good day. Today is Friday, 5th September 2025, and well, we've had more comments from President Putin of Russia, and we've also had more comments from President Zelensky of Ukraine, and we've had more comments from President Trump of the United States, and we've heard more statements about an emergency BRICS summit, which could be taking place within the next couple of days, though it is likely to be apparently a virtual summit. And lastly, we have a government crisis in Britain, even as the Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, returns to London from Paris, where he has discussed the latest meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. I'm just going to, before getting into the depth of this programme, the major topics that I'm going to discuss in this programme, I'm going to first discuss the situation in Britain, because after all, Britain is my country, it is where I live, and Keir Starmer is its Prime Minister and the head of the government under which I am governed. Well, I said in my programme yesterday that it did seem to me extraordinary that at a time of acute budgetary crisis, at a time when the Prime Minister's number two, the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Housing Minister, Angela Rayner, was known to be in severe political trouble, at a time when the financial markets have been increasingly concerned about Britain's long-term financial sustainability, at a time when all of these problems are coming together, that the Prime Minister of Britain, Keir Starmer, should choose to go to Paris, meet again with President Macron of France, and discuss with President of France and his friend, President Zelensky of Ukraine, the entirely fictional, imaginary topic of deploying European NATO forces to Western Ukraine, an idea for which the Americans, to repeat again, show no enthusiasm at all. We'll get onto that, all of that, later in a later part of this programme. So, nonetheless, despite all of that, Keir Starmer did go to Paris. He did participate in all the meetings there. In fact, he co-chaired the meetings with Emmanuel Macron, another leader, by the way, who is facing a financial crisis, a potential financial crisis, the defeat on Monday of his government's budget, and the almost certain resignation of his Prime Minister on Monday, if, as pretty much everyone expects, the French government on Monday loses a vote of confidence in the French Parliament. So, nonetheless, despite all of these problems, these two leaders, Macron and Starmer, get together and talk about these things, and Starmer himself, of course, left London as a political crisis was brewing. Now, before I continue, can I just say that this is not what many leaders around the world would do. The president of Indonesia, for example, had been invited to the SCO summit and to the celebrations, the Victory Day celebrations in China, but he called off his visit to China to attend the SCO meetings at the last moment because there were protests in Indonesia, important protests, not protests that would threaten his government, as far as I can tell, but nonetheless serious protests. And he felt that he needed to be in the capital, in Jakarta, to deal with these protests, even though membership of the SCO, and by the way of BRICS, is a key part of his programme and indeed of Indonesia's foreign policy programme. And the president of Indonesia sent a letter of apology to the Chinese government. And then when it seems that the protests got a little under control, he nonetheless did come to Beijing briefly to attend the Victory Day celebrations. So here we see a leader taking the exact opposite approach to Keir Starmer's. But Keir Starmer is focused on Ukraine. He considers this to be not just an important issue, but as far as I can see, the single most important issue. How else to explain the fact that in the middle of a budgetary crisis, he sends his Defence Minister, John Healey, to Kiev with apparently, so I hear, another £1 billion of financial aid for Ukraine. Anyway, that's what I've heard. I believe it's true. I've no doubt, in fact, that it is true. So this is, for Keir Starmer, apparently his priority. The slow-motion collapse of his government in London, the budgetary crisis Britain is facing, the stagnant state of the British economy, the fact that living standards in Britain appear to be in decline. These apparently are secondary to the most important thing, what he would say is deterring Russian aggression and standing by Ukraine. I have to say that to me, that looks like a total dereliction of leadership, a completely skewed sense of priorities. There have been some rather bitter articles which have appeared in the left-of-centre newspaper, The Guardian, which has strongly supported Keir Starmer in the past and which is still, I think, in general, sympathetic to him and to his government, and which, by the way, is fulsome in support of Ukraine. Anyway, The Guardian has published a series of articles, at least two, in which they have been complaining that over the course of the summer, the Reform leader, Nigel Farage, has dominated the political climate. He has been setting the agenda, whilst Starmer has been focused on Ukraine and has been on holiday. Farage has been busy holding a long succession of press conferences, explaining his ideas to the media and to the British people, discussing his policies on migration, on economics, on all kinds of things. Much of the commentary, much of the publicity that Farage has received has been extremely negative, at least from the media, but the fact remains that he has been talking about those issues that affect British people most directly and which, according to opinion polls, they care most about. But with the Prime Minister himself, well, he has been on holiday, and one shouldn't grudge a Prime Minister a holiday, at least from time to time. But he has also been focused, as I said, heavily on Ukraine. The fact that the government's support in the country continues its rapid and apparently unstoppable decline apparently doesn't deter him. He doesn't feel that he needs to change his approach on these issues. He instead proposes to remain narrowly focused on Ukraine, the topic of Ukraine. Well, in the meantime, as I said, his government is in deep crisis, and he's now lost, as I said, the Deputy Leader and Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, as a result of a tax scandal, which I have no intention of taking up time trying to explain. Suffice to say that since it involves tax that is paid on property sales, to be precise, and given the importance of the housing market for many people in Britain, it is a topic that will cut through and which people across Britain will certainly notice. Now, the loss of Angela Rayner, the minister in question, is a blow to Starmer. Angela Rayner and Starmer have not always got on. She originates from the left of the party. She was a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn when he was the leader of the Labour Party. She was a very close friend of Rebecca Long-Bailey, another Labour politician who was the politician who stood against Keir Starmer for the leadership of the Labour Party after Corbyn resigned, and who also comes from the political left. Nonetheless, though the relationship between them has not always been close, it's fair to say, I think, that Angela Rayner has been, on balance, a reasonably successful and in some circles even popular minister in the rather unhappy first year of this government. And, well, coming as she does on the left of the party and having built her career, as many Labour politicians in former times used to do, by working through the trade unions, working her way up through the trade unions. She was Starmer's bridge, both to those Labour MPs in the House of Commons who would still identify themselves, to some extent at least, as being on the left of the party, and perhaps even more importantly, to the trade unions, the organised labour outside politics, which in former times used to prop up the entire Labour Party and which still has significant influence within it. So Starmer losing her is going to weaken his position overall. It's going to open the doors for a leadership election to decide who will replace her as deputy leader. It is quite likely that whoever wins that election and who is appointed or elected deputy leader will be somebody well to the left of Starmer and perhaps less willing to work closely with him than Angela Rayner has been. And anyway, and beyond and beside that, at a time when there are already doubts about the longevity, the political health of Starmer's finance minister, Rachel Reeves, inevitably the fact that a key minister of the government has been forced to resign as a result of a scandal is going to have its effect and is going to reinforce the view that this is a scandal-riven government which is starting to crumble. Now, a more cunning, a more experienced, a more hands-on Prime Minister would have probably been able to avoid this mess. One obvious way forward that immediately occurred to me when I began to realise that Angela Rayner was in trouble was for Starmer to call her in, tell her that the scandal was growing, that she herself had agreed that the issue should be investigated. She insists that she always acted in good faith and misunderstood the admittedly very, very complex tax issues. Starmer could have asked her to stand down as a minister but remain deputy leader of the Labour Party until a full investigation into her conduct had taken place and when it was established whether it was true, as she insists, that she at all times acted in good faith and had simply made a mistake. At that point, she would have been able to return to the cabinet, and that's what Keir Starmer could have told her. And, well, it would still have been embarrassing and difficult, but it would have conveyed the impression of a Prime Minister in control, and it would have given Angela Rayner a lifeline, or at least a possible future lifeline, to re-enter the government, which might have ensured her loyalty now that she returns to Parliament as a mere MP, where she could, of course, conceivably become a focus of dissent against Starmer in the future. And, of course, Starmer didn't do anything like that. I doubt that the thought of doing something like that ever occurred to him. He, of course, as I said, is focused on Ukraine and Ukraine-related matters. So the fact that he was about to lose one of his key ministers, and that there were things that he could have done to at least mitigate the effect of that, and the effect on him personally of that, well, that, of course, really wasn't within his bandwidth. I have to say this. Keir Starmer is not just, in my opinion, a catastrophically bad manager of the government itself, but he is one of the least skilled politicians to occupy the post of Prime Minister that I can remember. Prime Ministers of former times, someone like, say, Harold Wilson or Margaret Thatcher or, well, others, James Callaghan, maybe, would have known how to deal with this situation far better than he seems able to do. Instead, he retains obsessed with the one overriding issue, the issue of Ukraine. Everything else must be subordinated to it. He's now beefed up his economic team in Downing Street, but nobody seriously expects a new economic policy coming from him. As I discussed in my recent programme, all of that looks like preparation to dispense with his finance minister, Rachel Reeves, and to put someone else more loyal to him in her place. I do wonder for how long this can go on. Sooner or later, even the Labour Party, where I believe the expression never hear Keir has now stuck. Anyway, sooner or later, I have to assume that even the Labour Party, even the Parliamentary Labour Party, will have enough and will say this has gone on longer than it possibly can. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Now let's talk about more serious people. Let's start perhaps with the most serious one, and that is the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed at some length the various very interesting things that Putin said over the course of a lengthy press conference that he gave in China following the Victory Day celebrations. A press conference to which, by the way, only the Russian media was invited. Now, Putin, after his trip to China, travelled to Russia's Far East, where he addressed an economic and development conference. And of course, he was asked questions, and many of the questions, again, were about the special military operation and about all of the various things that are taking place. And in a sense, his latest comments should be seen as supplementing the words that he used over the course, the things that he said over the course of that press conference that he engaged in Beijing. Now, I can summarize my own views about Putin's words over the last couple of days, both at the press conference and in this speech. Basically, it seemed to me that Putin was clearly signaling that this war is going to be won on the battlefield. He doesn't seem to be interested or really expecting a negotiated outcome. He said in the press conference that if the Russians don't achieve their objectives through negotiations, then they will achieve their objectives in the battlefield. He said that that is what the soldiers and the army wants, and he gave the clear impression that that is what he wants. As I discussed at length in my program yesterday, he cast very serious doubts on Zelensky's ability to act as a negotiator. He referred to Zelensky as the head of the current administration in Kiev. He does not recognize Zelensky as the president, the legitimate, lawful, constitutional president of Ukraine. I'm not going to rehash the reasons. I discussed them at length in my program yesterday. He does not expect that negotiations with Zelensky will achieve anything very much. And again, he said that in his speech at the Far East. The speech which he's just made in the Far East. He made again the facetious proposal, which apparently he first floated during the meeting with Trump in Anchorage, and then repeated in the press conference, and now he set it out again. He suggested again that if Zelensky wants to meet and wants to have discussions and negotiations, then, well, he's welcome to come to Moscow and he can talk to Putin there. Moscow is the obvious venue, as Putin said. And Putin also said that if Zelensky wants to come to Moscow and to have a meeting with Putin, well, not only would he be welcome, but it would be a talk about the way forward. It would not be setting Zelensky and Ukraine up for capitulation. Zelensky would not be expected to simply capitulate to all of Russia's demands at this meeting. Of course, Zelensky has rejected this idea outright. The Ukrainians have ridiculed it. And I can't believe that Putin really intends this in any way seriously. But Putin has repeated this again. He said that the Russians will do everything they can to make Zelensky stay comfortable, and he's welcome to come to Russia and to talk out all of the problems with them. But of course, in the meantime, his legal position continues to be unresolved, and there is an enormously complicated process in order to sort out the legalities in Ukraine. The whole martial law must be ended, elections must be ended, a referendum must be held. I discussed all this in my program yesterday. And Putin said quite straightforwardly that he didn't think any of this was practical or was likely to happen. And he really, again, said that he couldn't really see the point of discussions at the present time, discussions between himself and Zelensky at the present time. He's willing to have them, provided that they're held in Moscow, but he doesn't really think that this is serious. And he also appeared to say that suggestions that the meeting could take place in other places, in Istanbul, for example, well, that really isn't appropriate at this time. Moscow is the place to which Zelensky should go. Now, taken together, it seems to me that all of these things basically are signaling there's not going to be a negotiation, there's not going to be an outcome, a diplomatic outcome to this conflict. The war must continue. The soldiers are ready to continue the war. We're prepared to go and fighting the war. And that's the way this war is going to end. I did not discuss some things that Putin said over the course of the press conference in my video yesterday, which on reflection I think I should have done. Putin revisited again the whole topic of the Istanbul negotiations and agreement that was made in April 2022. And he again repeated his standard point that everything appeared to have been essentially agreed, but the Russians, against their better judgment, were persuaded to withdraw their forces from around Kiev as an act of goodwill. And then the Ukrainians, having seen the Russians withdraw from Kiev, told the Russians that they were no longer really interested in moving forward with the Istanbul discussions and with the Istanbul agreement. And Putin said that over the course of what appeared to have been relatively brief exchanges between the Russians and the Ukrainians at that time, the Ukrainians, in very coarse language, much coarser language than Putin said he was prepared to repeat, informed the Russians that from this point on it was a fight to the finish. Either the Ukrainians would twist the Russian leaders' heads off, or the Russians would twist the Ukrainian leaders' heads off. In other words, there would be either capitulation and regime change in Moscow, or there would be regime change and capitulation in Kiev. Now, I can't help but think that Putin brought up this exchange, which, by the way, I personally think almost certainly did take place. I don't myself doubt that an exchange like that did indeed happen. And by the way, there's been no denial that I'm aware of from the Ukrainian side. What Putin essentially was communicating by talking about that is that the Ukrainians chose this outcome. They chose an all or nothing outcome to the war. And they've got it. It's now going to be indeed a case of all or nothing. But given that the Russians are much more powerful and are winning, it is going to be for them nothing. They're going to end up with regime change in Kiev. Even if the Russians go through the motions of discussing things with the Ukrainians, the Russians, Putin himself, doesn't believe that these discussions are indeed going to lead anywhere. Anyway, that was what Putin said. Now, he also touched on other things. He again spoke about security guarantees. He said that security guarantees have to be discussed with the Russians. He made it absolutely clear that there have been no discussions with the Russians by the Western powers of security guarantees for Ukraine. There had been some claims earlier, immediately prior to the meeting in Anchorage, that the Russians and the Americans had talked about security guarantees for Ukraine. Witkoff and Putin supposedly had discussed security guarantees for Ukraine and Western military presence in Ukraine. Putin said that's not true. There have been no such discussions. The Russians have had barely any discussions with the Western powers about security guarantees for Ukraine at all. And he continued to say that Russia deserved security guarantees as much as Ukraine does. And he did speak about Ukraine needing to be secure. But of course, Russia needs to be secure as well. And that, of course, impacts on the arrangements for Ukraine's security. Now, Putin then went on to discuss this topic of Western forces in Ukraine. And he said that whilst the special military operation is ongoing, any Western troops who enter Ukraine go there as combatants and the Russians will attack them. But if there is a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, a peace agreement of the kind that was agreed in Istanbul in April 2022, and of the kind that he outlined as a potential future agreement between Russia and Ukraine in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, well then, since there is peace, since we are no longer talking about a ceasefire, since there would need to be troops to patrol a ceasefire in Ukraine, the presence of Western outside forces in Ukraine is no longer needed. It's not necessary because Ukraine and Russia will have agreed a peace treaty with each other. And therefore, these troops are not needed and they're not welcome. And he said straightforwardly, that is the end of the matter. Note again that Putin is implicitly saying that there is not going to be a ceasefire, that there is not going to be a freeze of the conflict. Ultimately, the entire discussion that has been taking place in the West about deploying European forces to Ukraine is based on the premise that there is going to be a ceasefire. And Putin has said there isn't going to be one. And he said that to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump agreed with him. It's there in Trump's Truth Social post. And there isn't going to be a ceasefire. So what is the point of discussing or even talking about this? Anyway, again, it is remarkable that the Russians say this again and again, and the Europeans simply don't want to listen. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that the Russians have as much right to talk about the presence of Western forces in Ukraine as they had to object to Finland's decision to join NATO. I'm going to say straight away that I think that was an incredibly unfortunate and unwise analogy, given how the Russians feel about Finland's decision to join NATO. After the long decades of peace and friendship that had existed between Russia and Ukraine, and given the way that the Russians feel that Finland, by joining NATO, betrayed the promises it made to Russia at the end of the Second World War, when Finland and Russia agreed peace with each other in 1944. Again, Western leaders say things, make comments which are almost calculated to raise Russian hackles. And of course, perhaps in this case, they are. I mean, it seemed an incredibly provocative thing to say, at least to me. And it's certainly one that is going to infuriate the Russians and is going to make them even more determined to see this thing through on the battlefield to prevent those NATO forces being deployed in Ukraine. Now, we've now had two full public statements from the president of Russia. To repeat again, I don't see that the Russian position has at any time substantively changed from the one that Putin set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. Putin, by the way, again in this speech in the Far East, as in his press conference, made comments about possible eventual entry into the EU by Ukraine. But it seemed to me that again, he appeared to be leaving the door open for the Russians eventually to object to that also. Just saying, I think this idea is in its last months, by the way. Again, I don't think that people in the West have remotely understood this. But anyway, Putin has made his position completely clear. He's talked about root causes many times. He's talked about what needs to be done to bring the war to an end. He said it in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June. He repeated it in his press conference in Anchorage in very brief terms. He set it out again in much more detail in the press conference that he gave in China, and he's done the same thing again in the speech that he gave at this forum in the Far East. I don't think there is any ambiguity at all in the Russian position. I don't think that the Russians are prepared to retreat from any part of it. I don't see any sign that they are interested in a freeze of the conflict in any respect. On the contrary, they seem to be ruling it out. It's been repeatedly claimed that the Russians, over the course of their discussions with Witkoff and Trump, Putin's discussions with Witkoff and Trump, floated the possibility of a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson regions if the Ukrainians were prepared to withdraw from Donbass. Putin has never said anything like that. The Russians have never confirmed anything like that. As I have already said in multiple programs now, why would the Russians propose a ceasefire when the whole thrust of their policy is to argue against a ceasefire? So anyway, there we are. That is the president of Russia. Now, it is clear, it is substantive, it is real, and it is backed by force. The Russian army is in Ukraine, and it continues its advance. Let us look at what now happened at that meeting in Paris, which Keir Starmer insisted on attending. The meeting of the so-called coalition of the willing. What did actually take place at that meeting? Well, we've now had a whole explanation of what was agreed by President Macron of France, and he said that 25 countries had agreed to contribute troops to a reassurance force to be sent to Ukraine when the ceasefire was agreed. The Russians are not agreeing to a ceasefire. But anyway, that was what Macron said. He said there's many other countries are also saying that they would support this process. He didn't outline which countries. He didn't explain what the contributions of the various countries were. 25 to 30,000 men is universally acknowledged to be far too few. And he also said that it's not for the Russians to argue about this. They are in a position to argue about this. Their army is advancing in Ukraine. They have a veto over this. And the sooner this is acknowledged and accepted in Europe, the better for everybody it will be. Anyway, Macron spoke all about that. And as I said, most people, I think, can see that this is all so much vague talk. Again, it's the same plan endlessly repeated, one that Macron and Starmer are committed to, but I noticed that Italy, Poland and Germany apparently will not be participating in this expeditionary force that is going to be sent to Ukraine. Now, Macron did, and Starmer did suggest that in order to get the Russians to agree to this, because everybody accepts that they have to agree to this in order for it to happen, greater pressure needs to be imposed upon them. And again, there is more and more talk about long-range missiles being used against Russia. More a return to missile strikes, deep strikes inside Russia using Western missiles. And Keir Starmer, Britain, has said that they will provide Ukraine with long-range missiles. And that does seem to be the policy of the European powers. Which long-range missiles precisely? Britain and France, as far as I know, the only long-range missile they possess in their arsenal is the Storm Shadow and the Scalp, and they have already provided huge quantities of those to Ukraine, pretty much as I understand it, the entire stockpile. And it must be said, they have proved to be essentially ineffective. Certainly they haven't changed the strategic realities on the battlefield. The United States supplied Ukraine ATACMS ballistic missiles, but it seems that President Trump and his administration are no longer prepared to do that. The Ukrainians had programs for two types of missiles that we know about. One was the Sapsan missile, which is a ballistic missile which was supposed to be similar in some respects to the Russian Iskander missile, though less sophisticated. The Russians claim that they have completely destroyed the entire program. They found out where the warehouses were, where these missiles were being stored, where the fuel was being prepared for these missiles. The Russians claim that they've destroyed this program entirely. The Ukrainians have put on display the Flamingo missile. This is a cruise missile which they claim to have developed by themselves, though it is widely acknowledged, I believe, that this is actually a British design, or to be more precise, the design of a British company put together in the Emirates and out there looking for customers. I've described this already. We're talking about a very big, very heavy, low speed, non-stealthy, high-flying missile, lacking maneuverability, a missile that could be easily intercepted and destroyed by the Russian air defenses. There's been some talk of the United States supplying Aram missiles. Perhaps these are the missiles that President Macron has been talking about. These are, as far as I can understand from what various people have been writing, these are not exactly missiles. They are bombs. They are precision-guided bombs, which have had a jet engine added to them. Though the two companies that were developing these missiles apparently, as of March, had got no further than producing prototypes. Now, many people believe Larry Johnson, the exceptional intelligence analyst, former intelligence analyst, and author of the invaluable Sonar 21 blog. Anyway, he says that he doesn't believe that this missile even exists. And I think he might be right about that. But assuming that he is wrong, I scarcely believe that there's anywhere near 3,000 of these missiles available to send to Ukraine at this time, as the Wall Street Journal suggested. And it's likely that this missile is still in the early stages of production, and the most number of these missiles the Ukrainians are likely to get is a few hundred, of a dribble, maybe not even a few hundred, maybe much less than that, over the course of this year. And as these are air-launched missiles, the Russians, of course, are in a good position to track and shoot down the aircraft that try to launch them. So it could be the ARAMs, but there's reasons for doubting this. Russian intelligence has suggested that the missile in question is really the Taurus missile, the German Taurus missile. I had suggested back in the spring that Friedrich Merz had already arranged deliveries of these missiles to Ukraine, and that they were already there in Ukraine. Indeed, I was expecting them to be used by the Ukrainians before the end of July, or even earlier. The Taurus, unlike all of the missiles that I've been talking about, would be a challenge for the Russians and for the Russian air defense system. It is a much more modern system. And, of course, Olaf Scholz consistently resisted supplying the Taurus missile to Ukraine, and it apparently continues to be a very controversial topic in Germany. And I understand that there is misgivings about this within the German military as well. But let's assume, I rather do assume, that Russian intelligence is correct, that the Taurus missile has indeed been supplied to Ukraine, and that this is the missile that the British, the French, the Europeans are talking about, and which will now be used to conduct long-range strikes against Russia. The problem with using the Taurus missile in this way is not only is it a missile that the Russians undoubtedly can shoot down and probably will shoot down. It's possible that a few of these missiles will get through. It's likely, in fact, it's a certainty that some will, but over time the Russians have repeatedly shown an ability to get on top of these missiles. But put that aside, I had been told authoritatively that the total number of these missiles that can be supplied to Ukraine is 150. There is a bigger stockpile of these missiles, but around half, around 400 of them, are apparently non-operational. They would have to be brought to an operational state. And besides, and beyond that, even 800 of these missiles is not going to be enough to change the military balance. The Taurus is apparently no longer in production, though there is talk that it might be put back into production again. And I understand that instructions to do that have been made, though I understand that no new Taurus missiles have been produced yet. So we're talking about a relatively small number of missiles, many of which the Russians are going to be able to shoot down. How is this missile going to change the military situation on a battlefield as vast and as complex as the one in Ukraine? And that is, of course, putting aside the real danger of Russian retaliation. The Russians have repeatedly said that the Ukrainians cannot operate this missile themselves. That would require German technicians to do. The Russians have repeatedly said that they've given themselves the option of launching retaliatory strikes on targets in Germany itself if these missiles are indeed launched against them, because they would treat it as an act of war. The Russians, of course, possess vastly more powerful missiles than the Taurus, missiles which Germany cannot intercept. This looks like an incredibly stupid, indeed incredibly foolish plan. It's, again, another example of the obsessive way in which the Europeans are approaching this whole topic of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I ought to say that there's been a lot of discussion about military production, the increase in weapons production in Europe over the last few weeks and months. There is a study out there, which I have not, by the way, read, which has actually researched the true state of shell production, artillery shell production. In Europe, there's been claims that Europe produced 1.5 million shells over the course of the last 12 months. This report apparently says that the true number is closer to 300,000 to 400,000. I cannot verify this. I don't have the industry details. But everything tells me, experience tells me, that this almost certainly is true. And it's been pointed out to me that Ukrainian artillery is being used less and less on the battlefronts. You can see this, by the way, in the videos. The Ukrainians now depend almost entirely on drones. And I'm told that the reason is not just that the Ukrainians are now critically short of artillery, of artillery shells, but they are also critically short of artillery guns, which are also in short supply in Europe, and that they've had to conserve most of their guns by moving them to the west bank of the Dnieper. So there it is. One threat, the missile threat, hardly one that is going to force the Russians to come to the table. But now we come to the next threat, which is the threat of sanctions. And this is where the entire meeting that took place in Paris basically fell apart. Now, over the course of this meeting in Paris, one person from the United States was expected to attend, and this was Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, the man who goes to Moscow and who meets with Putin there. He arrived in Paris. He was invited into the meetings. He was sitting there representing the United States. Except for most of the meetings he wasn't, because he left after 20 minutes. And this is where we come to the whole topic of the United States. Because all of the ideas about putting pressure on the Russians, pressure through sanctions, all of the ideas about deploying European troops in Ukraine depend not just on the Russians, they also depend on the cooperation of the United States. And this whole ball of security guarantees, troop deployments in Ukraine was set rolling, as I've discussed many times, as a result of a video conference, which took place 2 days before the summit meeting in Alaska, when Trump spoke with the European leaders, Merz and Zelensky and the others, in advance of the meeting in Alaska, basically in order to reassure them. And the Europeans left that discussion telling the media, telling everybody who wanted to listen, that Donald Trump had told them that he was prepared to give Ukraine security guarantees, and he was prepared to give the European forces that went to Ukraine a guarantee from the United States, a kind of backstop, if you will, and that Vladimir Putin over the course of his discussions with Witkoff, had dropped his opposition to the deployment of NATO peacekeepers in Ukraine. I didn't believe any of that before, and as the weeks since the summit in Anchorage have passed, and with every statement made by the Russians, by Lavrov, and now by Putin, we can see that all of that was wrong. Putin has never, the Russians have never dropped their objections to deployments of NATO peacekeepers. Putin has just told us at this speech he's just given in the Far East that there was never been any substantive discussion involving Russia about security guarantees. And as for the United States, I don't believe that Donald Trump has ever seriously intended to give the Europeans the kind of security guarantees and the Ukrainians the kind of security guarantees they have been asking for. And I believe that the reason Witkoff left the meeting after just 20 minutes is that he did not want to be put on the spot by the Ukrainians and the Europeans coming at him, demanding American agreement with specific details about security guarantees, which, according to rumour and story and fable, Witkoff and Putin discussed during their last meeting in Moscow. Well, Witkoff left, and then the next thing happened, and this is the most disastrous moment of all, and it's been confirmed, by the way, here by the mainstream media as well, because the Europeans and Zelensky all together then telephoned Donald Trump, and the purpose of the discussion again was to get Trump, to nail Trump down, to discuss security guarantees and backstops for the European force that was going to go to Ukraine. And just as Witkoff escaped the meeting in Paris, obviously in order to avoid talking about this very subject, Trump apparently stonewalled throughout the meeting. The Europeans found it impossible to pin him down. He was incredibly vague. Apparently, he provided no details. The meeting became increasingly tense and fractious. And of course, that then brought us to the next topic that the Europeans wanted to discuss, because they wanted to discuss the pressure that would be put on the Russians to get them to agree to all of these demands that Macron, Starmer and Zelensky and the others are trotting out for a freeze on the current contact lines and NATO forces and security guarantees to Ukraine. Because this brought them back to the question of the sanctions, the enormous sanctions that must be imposed on Russia and on its trading partners to get the Russians to capitulate and to agree to the demands of Starmer, Zelensky, Macron, and Merz. And it turned out that Donald Trump was incredibly vague and unhelpful about that. Instead, apparently, he pushed back aggressively and said, if you want me to impose sanctions on China and India in the kind of way that you demand, why don't you impose sanctions on India now? I have imposed my 25% tariffs on the Indians, or 50% tariffs, properly speaking, on the Indians because they are buying Russian oil. You have done nothing so far. On the contrary, you are continuing to buy oil from India, which you know ultimately comes from Russia. Why don't you stop doing that? Stop doing that, and then you can come to me, and then we can have this discussion. For the Europeans, of course, stopping oil purchases from India in that way would be a further critical problem for the European economies. Energy costs in Europe are already sky high, making them higher still by forfeiting the ability to buy oil from India, which ultimately originates with Russia, is not going to make consumers who are, of course, the electorates and the business community in Europe, pleased. But anyway, even the Western media admits that the entire discussion, the entire conversation became increasingly tense. And Macron, over the course of his press conference, then came back and said, well, we need to talk about what the Americans are going to do, and this is going to be all sorted out within the next couple of weeks or days. Now, I don't know when the penny is finally going to drop in Europe that this is a mirage. The Americans are never going to do anything that will risk catapulting the United States into a potential armed clash with the Russians. The Russians have said clearly, no Western troops in Ukraine. Putin said it in his press conference 2 days ago. He said it again yesterday in his speech at the Far East Asian Forum. How many times does this have to be reiterated? And given that this is the Russian stance, and given that the Americans do not want to involve themselves in a conflict with the Russians, there is no way that the Americans are going to come through on this. I read in the Financial Times some European officials actually apparently have been telling each other, what security guarantees from the Americans? How can we ever rely on promises of security guarantees from someone like Donald Trump, who changes and alters and adapts his position repeatedly in this sort of way? Well, really, properly speaking, that ought to be the end of the topic. And if we're talking about sanctions, here I must come back to what happened in China. Because, of course, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has made it absolutely clear that India is going to continue to buy Russian oil. And there seems to be an overwhelming consensus in India that that should continue. And, of course, he went to China, he met with Xi Jinping, and he met, of course, with Putin. And he has now invited Putin to India, and Putin is going to India in December. And there was a tremendous, tremendous statements of friendship between India and Russia. And it doesn't look as if the Indians are going to be intimidated or deterred from buying Russian oil because of whatever threats they've been receiving from the United States and from Europe as well. But India, very important as it is not as important as China. And what was the big, concrete, substantive event that took place over the last couple of days in China? It was the agreement between the Chinese and the Russians to build Power of Siberia 2, the gigantic gas pipeline that is going to transfer gas from the Yamal Peninsula, from the Arctic, gas which had been previously earmarked, by the way, for the Nord Stream pipelines. It's going to transfer all of that to China. Now, does anybody think that China would have signed off on a massive deal like Power of Siberia 2 at this time? There have been claims in the media, by the way, in the West, that all that the Russians and the Chinese signed was a memorandum of understanding. I've already said in a program that I did that I think it is inconceivable that the Chinese and the Russians would have signed a document of that kind, a legal contractual document of that kind, if nearly all of the underlying documentation that makes up the actual contract has not already been agreed. And I understand that Putin, in his speech in the Far East, has effectively confirmed that. I haven't, by the way, received a complete transcript of that speech, but I understand that he does confirm all of this in that speech. Anyway, why would the Chinese sign off on a deal like that if they're about to buckle to Western demands and are going to stop buying Russian oil? Surely the Chinese decision now makes crystal clear that this attempt to isolate Russia from its energy partners, its energy customers, has failed. The Indian affair has already been a massive debacle. India has been antagonized. It's now improving its relations with China. It's reaffirming its relations with Russia. The President of the United States has Donald Trump, who sometimes has more understanding of these realities than so many other people do, so many other supposedly cleverer, more intellectual, more well-informed people do. Anyway, he's made bitter comments about this. How else does one read this very bitter comment that he's just published on Truth Social? Looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China. May they have a long and prosperous future together! Exclamation mark. You can sense the bitterness, the sarcasm, the anger, because when people are bitter and sarcastic in this way, it is an infallible sign that they're also angry. Anyway, you could see it all in this Truth Social post, which has just been published a few hours ago by Donald Trump. So the Indian affair, the attempt to pressure India into not buying Russian oil, has been a debacle. And trying to pressure China now, which has a virtual monopoly on exports of rare earths, which provides such an enormously high proportion of the world's manufactured goods, that provides so many of the components that are essential to keep Western supply chains operating, that is, by the way, becoming a major chip exporter, a fact which people seem oblivious to. I was reading recently in the Financial Times that the Chinese government now has plans to treble production of high-end chips in China over the course of the next year. Anyway, just to say, China has just signed off a massive energy deal with Russia. It's reaffirmed its strategic partnership with Russia. How does anybody in Europe, in the United States, now honestly think that restarting the economic war against China that was attempted in the spring and which failed so disastrously is going to make the Chinese change their minds on all of these commitments to invest in Russian energy, which they have just made? This is foolishness. It is a complete denial of reality. It shows how detached from reality the leaders of Europe have now become. How this obsession with Ukraine is making it impossible for them to see beyond the parameters of the obsession itself. Donald Trump, who is not obsessed by Ukraine, can see it. Looks like we've lost India and Russia to deepest, darkest China. But the European leaders, they continue in exactly the same way. They are now going to try and pressure the Americans to relaunch the economic war against China, because how else can this work? They're going to try and get, presumably, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal to activate their bill. Whether it will now pass, by the way, is a much more problematic question. I would have thought that even in a place like Congress and the Senate, there will be many people there who will have, there will be some people there at least, who have grasped the scale of the Indian debacle, though you never know. Anyway, they want, as I said, Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal to reactivate their bill to get these massive tariffs on China. All that will do is it's going to make the condition of the Western economies much, much worse, even as those economies are already in a critical position. Now, that brings me again to the point. The missile threat is an empty one. The sanctions threat is a bust. Brazil, by the way, I think I've said in several programs, Brazil is now indeed calling an emergency meeting of the BRICS. The Russians say that it's going to take place on a video footing within the next few days. The purpose of this emergency meeting of the BRICS is clearly to formulate policies to deal with the threat of tariffs and sanctions from the United States and the Europeans. I suspect much of the work on this has already been done, which is why the Brazilian presidency is calling this meeting now. They've probably already got a plan ready, and the purpose of the meeting will be to basically sign off on it. I noticed that the Chinese have said that they're prepared to help any country that gets itself in difficulties as a result of the tariffs, and apparently India and Russia are saying the same. So we're going to get an emergency meeting of the BRICS within the next couple of days. I've been saying this is going to happen for some time now, and that again underlines the fact that the sanctions threat is a bust. So why go on? Why persist with all of this? Why persist with all of these threats of sanctions, the talk about missiles, all of these things? Well, my colleague Alex Christoforou says that this is all, to a great extent, still about trying to keep the Americans engaged in Europe. And I agree. But this has been taken to the point of idiocy now. We've already had a grotesquely unbalanced trade agreement between the United States and the European Union, the one that Trump and Ursula signed off on 2 weeks ago. We now have American pressure on Europe to stop buying Indian oil. Even if Trump was perhaps talking defensively, it is likely that this will now become an American demand. And as I've said already, that inevitably is going to cause a further upward spike in energy costs in Europe, which is already suffering acutely from the cost of energy, which has made European industry uncompetitive and which is having a disastrous effect on living standards across Europe. But anyway, we have that, and well, we see that they still demand even more sanctions, even more threats, and they talk about missiles. And well, the missiles aren't going to get or achieve very much. Speaking about military production, I read, I think it was in the Financial Times, an article which was not actually about this question, but about, it was, to be precise, it was about the current economic crisis in France and the necessity for the French government to take steps to try to improve the budget situation, because unless that happened, the situation in France could careen out of control. That was actually the topic of the article. But buried inside it, the author mentioned the fact that there are these growing concerns about the stability of the French economy, and that is going to call into question France's ability to engage in the great rearmament program that all of the European countries seem for the moment to be so set on. And he said that in order to illustrate the extent of the problem, he decided that he was invited to visit France's main drone factory, as it was described to him. And he said he went there expecting to find a whole production line, like the one that the Russians have now established in Kazan for the Duran drones, which you can see, you get all of these pictures. There's a proper production line. They're being manufactured in the same kind of way that car manufacturers make cars. It's the same kind of production line there. Anyway, he went there expecting to find something like that. He found a workshop in which everything was handmade, and he was told that the French military operates just 14 drones of the type that this factory, the lead factory in France making drones, military drones, is producing. So that is the reality of the situation, both economically in some respects and industrially, in Europe at this time. Now, I would like to believe that this is going to be the last of these coalition of the willing meetings, because surely on any logical basis, after what Putin has said, after what the Chinese and the Indians have done, after the straightforward reluctance of the Americans, it ought to be obvious that this whole thing has gone as far as it can. Instead of the Europeans endlessly talking to each other, the right thing for them to do, and this is obvious, is for them to do what Putin is in effect now suggesting. Putin has facetiously suggested that Zelensky come to Moscow and conduct negotiations there. Well, Zelensky probably cannot do that, but the Europeans can. So why don't they? Why don't they talk to the one party that really matters, which is Russia? Why are they leaving it entirely to the Americans to talk to the Russians, creating all this confusion about what Putin said to Witkoff and what Witkoff said to Putin and all that? Why do they refuse to engage the Russians in serious discussions? Just saying. And if they start to do that, well, in theory, some way back might be found. But they are not going to do that. Putin has made no concessions, no retreats. He's not budged an inch from the position that he took when he spoke to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June, 2024. And we see that he has now gone further than he has ever done before to make clear that this war is going to be concluded on the battlefields. Now, I'm going to finish this video by saying a little bit about the situation on the battlefields. There are still a lot of denials in some places about the fact that the Russians have established a clear presence in Kupiansk, despite the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry has released film that shows Russian soldiers moving around central Kupiansk, and I don't see much sign of fighting going on there in these video films. The Russians also appear to be continuing their remorseless advance eastwards in western Donbass. They appear to have they've captured positions close to the big village. Actually, it's more a small town of Veliko Mikhailovka on their way to Zaporozhye. But the big battle continues to be the battle in Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians are telling everybody that there's been a major reorganization of Russian forces and that hundreds of military vehicles, tanks and armored vehicles, Russian armored vehicles, and thousands of troops, Russian troops, are moving in the direction of Pokrovsk, and that the Ukrainians expect a massive Russian attack there at some point over the next couple of days. Well, that may or may not be true, but one thing does seem to be true, and that is that the Russians have significantly enlarged the area that they control in central Pokrovsk, and they appear to be close to cutting not just the E50 road, but another road that leads into Pokrovsk from the northwest, a smaller supply road. It appears that they're close to cutting that road off, to cutting that road as well, and thereby completely cutting the Ukrainian troops in southwest Pokrovsk from all their supplies. There are lots of claims of Ukrainian counterattacks in this area, and I watched video footage that the Ukrainians have released of one, which appears to show some kind of counterattack in the Mirnograd area. But it was very difficult for me to make much sense of this video, and as far as I could see, it didn't actually provide much detail of any real success in this counterattack. Some Russian soldiers were captured, but basically that was about all. No doubt the Ukrainians are throwing everything they possibly can to prevent the fall of Pokrovsk. A little like what happened during the Battle of Bakhmut in the spring of 2023. Just as Bakhmut was seen by the Ukrainians, rightly in my opinion, as critically important to the cohesion of their defense lines, so Pokrovsk is even more important than Bakhmut is. And just as the Ukrainians concentrated an enormous number of troops and equipment to try to hold the Russians in Bakhmut, and as a result caused their army to suffer terrible losses ahead of their own offensive in towards the Black Sea in the summer of 2023. I get the sense that they're doing exactly the same in Pokrovsk. I think in the case of Pokrovsk, I can at least understand why. Were Pokrovsk to fall, it does seem to me that Konstantinovka and the other two more northerly towns, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, would be at serious danger of being outflanked. And I can understand why the Ukrainians are trying to hold Pokrovsk at all and any cost. But going back to what Gerasimov and Putin said, in effect about aggressive attrition, about grinding down the Ukrainians, about the fact that the Ukrainians are burning up their remaining reserves, and both Gerasimov and Putin spoke about this, and are burning up their best brigades by shuttling them around the battlefronts to try to plug the holes. Well, surely this is part of the Russian strategy in Pokrovsk. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, before Gerasimov and Putin spoke, I was told by someone who has access to information about the Pokrovsk battles from Russia, that this is exactly what the Russians are doing, that they're using Pokrovsk as another meat grinder to grind down what is left of the Ukrainian army. Well, nonetheless, despite that, I still believe that Pokrovsk, the Battle of Pokrovsk, will end relatively soon. Again, I don't want to put a date on it. I could see anyway the way that things appear to be going. And as I said, the Russians are also advancing in other places, in Kupiansk, in Siversk, towards Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, in western Donbass. But this is where I'm going to finish today's program. So let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon. Have a very good day.